Plugin of the week is the FabFilter Pro L. Pro L, as with all of the other plugins, Pro C, Pro Q, which is EQ, Pro C, which is compressor, etc., 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 go down the line. Pro L is a Pro limiter. And this offers a few different limiter functions, some sort of tucked in levels of limiting and compression, and a very simple graphic user interface. So when you really start with this, essentially this is sort of a limiter, brick wall style limiter that you could use in a mix, on a mix bus, which is how I'm going to demonstrate it, sort of as a mastering, end of mastering kind of plugin, which is really more along the lines of where it's headed in terms of the design. If you're familiar with something like the Waves L2 plugin, where you sort of pull the threshold down and it automatically pulls up the gain, you're getting a very similar type of thing here. Now, there's a couple ways to approach that type of thing. One is to actually pull a threshold down and everything automatically gains up, or the other thing is to add gain to the input, so you're sort of hitting a threshold that is set. So you don't really have a threshold setting per se. You're pushing your input gain up over the threshold, and then you're making the output achieve a certain level. Now, this is the simple user interface that comes up when you first boot it. And what you have is an input gain and output gain. And they could be staged together, which is kind of cool. So if I actually hold the shift key in this case, and it says something different in the manual, so you may have to check if you're on a PC. I'm on a Mac checking this out, so it may be a little bit different here. But if I shift and I drag this up, you'll notice that it's pulling this down at the same time. Okay, and that's important, right? So when you're actually looking at the gain, it looks pretty dramatically different. Like this is moving a lot faster, and that's just because the way this is scaled. So it's not evenly scaled all the way through. So if you just saw that change right there, bringing that up, that's like 2 dB, just to give you an idea. So as I pull this up, by 2 dB, that's swinging over by that same amount, and they just don't look the same, but it's actually keeping the gain even. There's an idea behind this, which is sort of when you're setting your level. One of the things when you're trying to do peak limiting is that you want to be able to hear what it is that you're doing. And if the gain is automatically making up and making it louder, the tendency is to always like what's louder, and then you're not really hearing the distortion as soon as you can. And it's harder to A-B, because when you A-B, you bypass it, all your gain goes away. So it is an important aspect to this. There's also a look-ahead feature. This is really cool because this determines how quickly it's going to grab onto the transient when it's attacking. And this is an important feature. Like, you think this is just something that just should happen. It should be instantaneous. But the look-ahead feature actually allows it to sort of compensate even more so for that. It can still keep the signal strength or the signal from going above your peak, whatever your output setting is, but you get a little bit more control, and you'll hear the subtlety in the way that it adjusts the transient. And then you sort of have this, which is an interesting addition here. And this is a sort of compressor built into it, but it's working more on the sustain characteristic. You have also a thing here which allows you to, a selection here which allows you to select the type of limiting that's occurring. And we'll kind of go through some of the different options there. Now, with the basic display here, we can also, this is an interesting thing, there's channel linking between the center or the left and the right channels. And so if typically most transients in a mix occur center, they're like, kick snare energy is like typically something that sort of cuts or pops through. But you can set it so that you're unlinking the left and right side, so that they actually, if there's a transient on one side or the other, it'll apply the peak limiting on that side, but not on the other, and you got a percentage variation in between. And then you could also control the release characteristic. So sometimes setting this to 0 creates a little bit more stereo separation, or it could just sort of bludgeon your mix a little bit. Bludgeon is a very strong word, but that's the basic idea. So what you'll see here is levels coming across in gain reduction, and then you got some other settings here, which I'm going to open up in the bigger display. Well, actually, you got the normal toolbar that you get with the FabFilter stuff. You got a thing called ISP, which is intersample peaks. And what this means is that whatever sample rate that you're at, sometimes in the process, and this is very much a mastering thing, in the process of a file being maxed out in terms of the gain, and you're cutting down those peaks, you would think that if you set your output level to 0, that no digital signal could pass beyond 0, but that's not actually the case. You can actually have what are called intersample peaks. So peak signals that have passed above your 0 dBFS, but they're not registered because they're in between. So sort of think of it like that one side of the peak is kind of hitting a maximum, the other side of the peak is hitting the maximum, and it just sort of squared off. But then there's sort of a momentum effect to it that sort of pushes it above there in the analog component. So when it comes to on the analog side, you actually get it as clipping. And this is quite often why a lot of masters, they don't put an output level at 0. The output level quite often is like minus 0.1 or minus 0.2. And that becomes like a target output that gives you just that little bit of extra so that it doesn't clip on the end. So the ISP is meant to, what it's meant to do is it's basically upsampling everything so that, or it's actually, I'm sorry, it's kind of keeping an eye on that, and it's responding to intersample peaks, and therefore you get a little bit more effective limiting on that end. There are a couple of scales that we can go through. We're going to talk about some of those in the K scale and all of that. You know, this just turns on and off the metering. Down in the bottom, you got a few different settings. The MIDI learn, which allows you to assign MIDI controls to it. You also have oversampling. The oversampling is something that allows you to upsample your processing, which improves the quality of the limiting. There's some trade-offs with it. It obviously eats up a bit more CPU power, but you can put this in and it just increases the accuracy of the work that's being done by the components. There's dithering. So if you're actually putting this on the very last plugin, which is where it would be the very last plugin slot before heading off to your master to burn to 16-bit, for example. And so if this is where you would apply the dithering, you would select how much you're dithering down to. Now you say, well, why would you dither down? How could you dither down to 24-bit if you're at 24-bit? But you could be at 32-bit, at least on and so then you could dither down technically to 24-bit. Most of the time it's just right down to 16-bit for CD. And what that does is it helps to keep some of the quality or presence and depth that you have with a 24-bit recording in 16-bit fashion. And then there's some noise shaping options when you kind of go on to there. So let's talk about, let's open up the bigger display here. And so if we go to a normal display, then what we're going to have here is we're going to have, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, what we're going to have is a full display that's now going to show our audio signal. And what we're going to see here is, a couple of things. Now the display changes and those knobs go away, and they appear right over here, most of them, which is all of those settings that you saw on the simplified display. Now your metering shows up on the right-hand side. Some of your options that were down at the bottom left show up over here, and now your gain control appears separately on a slider here. So if I open up the advanced setting, for example, what I can do is I can start by getting some peak limiting. So I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the shift key. Oops, and that didn't work. Oh, I'm sorry. The gain actually, the gain output gain is over here. So I'm just going to kind of open that up so you can just see where that is right there. So what we're seeing here in red is the gain reduction. And then if I close this down here, what we're seeing in blue is the output level. And this is the input level, right? So in gray. So you're seeing the net result of what you're doing here. And by linking those two inputs now, when I bypass, I can actually really hear what it is that I'm doing. For the most part, really what I'm doing is I'm just catching snares. And I can see how much gain reduction here, which is down to like around -4 or so. Now this gets into where I can adjust the scale. So I'm going to shut this down for a second here. And where I could do this, I could set this up so that the scale shows like 16 is the full length. So now you'll see more dramatic looking or more accurate looking measurements on the peak signals, and you're seeing the lower average there. So this is sort of the in-between point, and the other one would give you much more of the full audio signal and a smaller display on the amount of gain reduction. Okay, so that's actually just gives you some metering options, which are kind of cool. There's also the K system. The K system was created by Bob Katz in the late 90s, and it's designed to be more of a way of trying to get an industry standard for levels. And this is something that exists in film and post-production work, where the levels and everything that it basically in the film industry, when you get into that, they have very specific output levels. In fact, their monitoring systems are set up where the monitor level control actually has an SPL level on it, not an actual just sort of random volume, and it just happens to be whatever the meter shows on the loudness. Like, they very carefully calibrate it. So when they make the mix, they actually make the mix to bring it up to the industry standard level that matches that pot. And this way, when the signal actually feeds out, when you go off into theaters and stuff, they're calibrated so that every movie basically comes in. They can turn it up overall, up or down, and you can compress the bottom up to the top, but the top is always at this exact same level. And most of the post work is done at a K12. So that means that what you're seeing is there's 12 dB of headroom, and you're seeing a different meter. This is not a dBFS scale, so you're seeing signal. This is your headroom up above the top here. And for music, most of that is in the 14, K14. K20 would be more for classical, something that has like a real broad dynamic range. And where this is beneficial is that it has an actual target scale that you're going for here, right? Because what you see in the metering here is peak signals, which are kind of coming up into the yellow here. And then you're seeing your RMS levels, which are displaying right here. So now this is displaying a little bit lower overall because, just so that the gain isn't excessively loud. I'm going to do it in a different way, actually, where I can take the output gain and bring it down so I can kind of max this out, and then we can kind of see the overall level. So what I'm going to do here is I have an enemies plugin over here, an L2 plugin. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring my output gain down here. So there's actually not going to be any gain reduction. But what it allows me to do now is that it's going to allow me to set my output level on the Pro Q2 here. So what I'm going to do is set this here and kind of bring this up a little bit more towards where I would set it. So let's just say we set it at minus 0.2 or something like that. Oops, I just went way past that. So let's just set it there for a second. All right. And then I'm just going to use this to bring my overall output level down so we can get it a good monitoring level. So this looks a little bit more like a mastering session here. So the gray area, okay, so we have our input level here, we have our output level, which is the gray area. So now we're seeing our gain here. And now if I sort of zoom in a little bit here on the display, we can see there's actually some peaks coming in. So let's set our scale up here for a second. Close this guy down. And now let's go back here to, so you're seeing our gain reduction here. We're seeing our output level here. And now we're seeing, this is our average level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it back to 32 so we can bring this up. And what we're seeing here is if our peak is at 0, what we're seeing here is this is something a little bit less than about a 10 dB, what do we call the difference between the peak and the average level, the crest factor. And so that's kind of an important thing to understand because it gives you an indication of actually how loud your master is. So sometimes there are sort of target levels that you go after. So, for me, like if you're like in like a 8 dB difference or something like that, you're getting towards a pretty hot master. I've had tracks that have gone above that, but they have a lot of very long sustained material like bass instruments that really, really drag out, and that pulls the RMS level way up higher than might normally be. like in a reggae track or a track with a low end. It's just like this real long resonant low end, and it kind of hangs over. So it's a little bit different with every kind of music, but those are some targets or things that you would be going after. So in working with this, what I'm doing is I'm working with an oversampling of 4 times. And then I have the dithering off. I'll just kind of show that to you real quick. Dithering, just if I wanted to bring this down into 16-bit, you usually apply some form of noise shaping. Because dither is basically noise that's added in, so that what it does is it randomizes the lower bit energy so that it brings a little bit of that randomness into the lower bit structure of the 16-bit that is apparent in the other 8 bits that make up the 24-bit. And this randomization is actual noise that's brought in, so it does add noise overall. And the shaping here that you see is meant to bring out or shape the noise and move it into areas where your hearing is less likely to hear it. That's the basic idea of it. And the effect is basically, or can be effectively, the same. And so there's a couple different settings that you can kind of go through here. And the difference is very subtle. And out of those, I like the optimized. And what I listen for when I listen to this, and I'm not going to turn it into a dithering exercise, is that you really want to listen for the feeling of depth perception. That's usually what I listen for. That's usually a measurement of like the quality of the detail will usually come out in that type of thing. Now, there is a couple of other things here that are kind of cool that are part of this. One of these is like the look ahead feature and the style of limiting. So here, what I could do here, I can go into different styles. This give me a little bit more of a transparent. So that preserves some of the natural openness of the track. And then punchy. Go back to transparent. So far, that's clearly the best. This is like almost a little bit thin sounding. I like the dynamic. Has the right amount of musicality to it. There's also a look ahead feature here. And this is something that you generally want to put a little bit of it in. What'll happen here is if I start to crank this up, it'll actually sound like it's warming up the transient more. Just a little bit less edge to it. So this is actually something, it's a very subtle thing, but it's worth throwing in like a little bit here, even if it's just like 0.1 or 0.2. And what it'll do, you kind of do it by ear, and it's very subtle. You may not even hear the difference when you're working with it, but what it'll do is it'll sort of grab the audio ahead of time, pre-prepare the processing, so when it's applied, it's like it's more accurate to those as opposed to the information coming in and the calculations being done more instantly. Like it just gives it that little extra buffer on this. And you would think this would be taken care of by the buffering of the audio software, but apparently this is also part of the process that kind of helps make this work a little bit better. Now, there's also an attack released kind of thing here, which is kind of cool, because what we could do here with this is we could work a little bit of the RMS signal here. I can make this come a little bit more alive. Now, this is not the limiter, by the way. Versus, so you could see here how it's kind of smoothing out more of the averaging of the sound, and that's like 10 seconds here. So it's giving you like more of a sustain as opposed to or determining basically the amount of sustain and the recovery. So I can make the recovery really fast, and you can see the peaks recover really fast. Sometimes just finding something that's like kind of a musical value, like an eighth note here is like 300 milliseconds, and then finding an attack time that sort of allows this to kind of open up a little bit. So this is like a subtle way of kind of controlling and shaping the way that the limiting is actually occurring. And then, of course, I have the channel linking, so I can make the transients a little bit more transparent, left to right. And also the release characteristics. And in this example, I'm not really hearing any kind of a difference because all the transients are really coming from the center. So I'm not sure that this is really doing anything for us from that level. But you can see here, like when you really start to dig into this, how you can really shape the sound. Very, very cool limiter, as for a mastering limiter. Really amazing, powerful, lots of controls. The oversampling, the ISP is really cool, really to guarantee that you're not clipping. And then you can see like there was a clip that registered here, probably as I was kind of working through the sounds. So that's something that I would want to clear and set up. But a very, very cool limiter. FabFilter always makes great stuff, and this is no exception. Really love this plugin. Really, really cool one. Very musical sounding once you kind of get into it. If you're feeling a little bit like you're not sure what you're going to, then kind of open up some of the different presets and kind of monitor and take a look at the settings and the way that they go. You can actually lock the output gain setting, which may change by clicking here. And so when you go through the settings, it's not going to change your gain structure settings. So as you switch through the presets, it's switching all the other stuff. Because obviously once you set that, it kind of gets it, it's kind of going along there. All right, so there we have it. There is our plugin of the week, a very cool one. The FabFilter Pro L.